Hi everyone, I'm Meric and I will be presenting you the paper titled Future-Proofing Multilingual Fake Speech Detection. First, let's start off with the motivation of this study. This is actually a follow-up on my previous work, which was focused on fake speech detection at English speeches. Now, with this work, I extended the language scope from only English to almost 50 other languages. Throughout the presentation, I will answer the questions like, do models learn how a language is spoken and how generative models speak that language, or do they learn a specific trait of human speech and generated speech regardless of the spoken language? Actually, there are lots of works in this area, all using different types of models, different features, and different datasets, but only few of them work with multilingual scope as I did, and none of them actually does unbiased tests. They either test the model on the same distribution with the training dataset, or their test dataset has some same aspects with the training dataset, whether it be the used text-to-speech model or the language. Before explaining how my work does these so-called unbiased tests, let's quickly go over the models and the data processing steps. I used GoogleNet, ResNet, and one other CNN model called MidCNN in my work, and I am using CNNs on audio data because I am working on images that are extracted from the audios, but we will come to that later after quickly finishing the models. There isn't much to explain with GoogleNet and ResNet models since they aren't any important changes in the architecture, so we can continue with the last one. The model MidCNN that I mentioned is an improved version of the basic CNN from the initial research, hence the name MidCNN. And it carries the same task of being a benchmark to indicate if the task requires some high-level models or not. That's why it has such a plain architecture. And I use my three CNN models, GoogleNet, ResNet, and MidCNN, with different types of features that I obtain from the spectrum extraction. The spectrum is how I turn audios into images. In total, we have 5 different features which are called cum3, absolute, angle, imaginary, and real. Last four are extracted from a matrix we call signature image, and cum3 is the third order cumulant. I will not go deep in the math, core, or the implementation. You just need to know that this signature image is a matrix with complex values, and we compute our 4 features from the polar coordinates using these complex values. Here is a somewhat simplified diagram for you to get the core idea. I compute a set of signature images and third-order cumulants from audio segments with signal processing, and then average them to get the average signature image and average third-order cumulant of the audio. Then I can extract the other 4 features from the signature image. Here are some visualizations for each extracted feature from the same speech that is generated by different text-to-speech models. And at the most left columns, you can see the additive noise augmentation effect on the features. Each CNN model is trained with individual features, the 5 I just talked about, and also with the concatenation of all 5 of them called multi, which is a 5-layered image basically. Okay, now I can start with the main important part of the paper, datasets, and explain how I constructed the training and testing sessions. I split the datasets in 2 parts, English and multilingual, and named the models differently as English models, multilingual models, or complete models depending on the training datasets they use. And there are clear versions of these models too, which are trained only on the non-augmented parts to measure the effect of the augmentation. Also, there is a full-tail dataset, which I keep separate from the split and separate it into 2 pieces in itself. And the reason for that is it's a bit specially created for some experiments, so we don't use it as we do with the others. For the datasets, you don't need to memorize the names since the naming is not important. I will explain everything and guide you through the results. Just be sure to understand this upcoming Venn diagram. Here is our diagram and some explanations on why I call the dataset specially created. If we focus only on the datasets that I created for this project, which are L2LSM and FullTel, you can see the use of tools for dataset creation. And this little overlap of languages in between is the reason why I split the FullTel in two different datasets disks at the previous image, as you can see on the top right corner. In the creation of these datasets, I try to keep everything as separate as possible because this split allows us to do fully unbiased tests. With this, I can, for example, train the models on a set of languages and then test on another set of languages with no overlap in between. Or I can, for example, train the models on multiple text-to-speech models and then test them on another text-to-speech model that they haven't seen in the training dataset. We call this type of testing unbiased since models don't have any prior information about the tests. On the right side, you can also see the distribution of the languages inside the L2LSM dataset, which is the big pink circle. Number of English audios are intentionally selected in this way to represent the English and multilingual distribution in the training dataset. And this point of having more English audios will be important in our second experiment. Now we have all the knowledge to judge the experiments. I made four types of experiments that lead me to my final hypothesis. First, I will walk you through the experiments, explain the hypothesis, and then test it. Starting off with the known language from known AI. It is basically bias test, which is just the testing on the test portion of the same dataset. It evaluates the models on the test of their testing dataset and is expected all scores are high. All of them are above the 88%, so that is a very nice performance. What I want you to do is to get familiar with the x-axis being the models. Always check the y-axis minimum and maximum values because they change at each graph, and also pay attention to colors for the upcoming plots. I will go over the plots and their meanings. You can ignore the individual scores and look at the lines to see which line is above or under which to keep up with me. Also, dataset names will probably sound confusing and you will probably forget them by now, but there's no need to memorize them, as I said. Just pay attention to the upcoming small diagrams that indicate which dataset we are testing our models on. Here is the small diagram for the second scenario, unknown language from unknown AI. It focuses on the tests performed on the full SILT dataset. Since it's outside the altruism circle, there is no overlap of languages, and the text-to-speech model is not seen by the models in the training. English learned models scored worse than the random decision. The scores are almost all of them are below the 50% line. Multilingual models scored all sorts of scores between 0 and 100, and complete models scored in between the previous two. As a conclusion, we can say that having a balanced dataset is more important than having a bigger dataset because English models and English audios are overwhelmingly more than any other language, but still results are a bit noisy to conclude any certain idea. Our third scenario is known language from unknown AI. This time it focuses on the performance on FullTil, which is from known languages, but again with a text-to-speech model that's not seen in the training. English models scored again worse than random decision-making. Multilingual models again scattered all the way around between 0 and 100, and complete models are somewhere in between. Looks like knowing the language doesn't help if you don't know the generative model behind the speech. And lastly, for our fourth scenario, unknown language from known AI scenario, let me first introduce my hypothesis. We checked two scenarios with unknown text-to-speech models and various languages, whether it be known or unknown. And if we weren't successful at scenario 2 and 3, as we were in the first bias test scenario, then the key point may be knowing the text-to-speech model behind the speech. If we train our models on wholesale, we can test this hypothesis by testing the models on wholesale and anatolism. As I said, there is our little diagram which shows arrows in the small Venn diagram, which for this time shows which dataset models are trained and then tested on. And the plot lines, we see that blue wholesale test scores are higher than green scores. And this contrast between two datasets having different generative models supports our hypothesis of models training the traits of the speaker model, not how the languages are spoken. I also did another experiment with different types of augmentations. I added AI-generated background noises to real speech audios and also real background noises to fake speech audios. Performances were generally good, again above the 83%, which shows us that the models distinguish audios by learning a specific trait of the speech, not a specific trait of the whole recording or the audio. That means even if there is some misleading adversarial attack, if this attack is not done on the speech itself, then it can be overcome by the models. Also, these high scores explain that the applied Gaussian noise augmentation also works with some other adversarial attacks, so this is a nice way to help with the generalization. To finish it up, there are two important improvements for further works to do. First one is to try this experiment with also other features than B-spectrum, and the second one is to try some different models other than CNNs, since these results may only be limited to B-spectrum or CNN cases. And with that, I thank you for listening to me and paying attention to my work.